Good morning from California. I'd like to thank the organizing committee of the Somali Studies International Congress for bringing us together. I'm grateful to my co-panelists, to Dr. Jama Musa Jama, Tirsa Diad Barak, and Jigjiga University. Thank you and Mahad Sanid. I want to talk about my research on the politics of law and religion in Somali history. I currently live in the United States, and here some people, when they think of the politics of law and religion, they think of things like violence, extremism, fundamentalism. Because of extremism, religion, and especially Sharia, has been denigrated. The Arabic word Sharia is often translated in English as Islamic law, but it's much broader than what we think of as law in Western political theory. Rather than being a strict legal code, Sharia is an ethical code guiding behavior, coming from the Quran and the Hadith, which means that different people and different governments have interpreted it in different ways. I'd be happy to talk about this more in the Q&A, but right now, with few exceptions, Western governments and policy analysts see Sharia as a means for repressive governments to restrict human rights. Nearly all 50 US states have introduced bills banning Sharia. The map you see shows the different, nearly 200 different anti-Sharia laws introduced across the United States. US senators have used words like evil or incompatible to describe Sharia and its relationship with American law. The European Court of Human Rights has ruled that Sharia is incompatible with human rights. And some legal scholars perpetuate this fear, arguing that God is contrary to the rule of law. Here's a quote from a recent paper. The rule of law and the rule of God are on a collision course because religion offers a credible threat to the liberal constitutional narrative. So these people see Sharia as a threat to modern constitutionalism and the rule of law itself. But my question is empirical, and it's relevant to the future of the Somali people and the policies that are designed. Can Sharia limit arbitrary power and rebuild the rule of law? And more specifically, what does Sharia do for colonial administrators, post-colonial governments, aid workers, activists? I traveled to Somaliland to answer this question, and I didn't just see Sharia surviving, but I saw Sharia thriving as a historical source of social and legal order. Let me tell you a story. I remember meeting with a young lawyer, we'll say his name is Tayyib, and we met outside a courthouse in Hargeysa. And he was in his 20s, sophisticated. We spoke about his career in law, the cases he was taking in the courts, the United Nations funded projects he's part of. And I thought one day Tayyib might become an important official or maybe even president or chief justice. So I asked him, what do you want to do in your life? And he said he wanted to stop being a lawyer. I was confused why he would give it all up. And then he said this, I want to be a sheikh. Sheikhs preach obedience to God. Throughout Somali history, as you see in these photos, they've used their understanding of Islam to help people resolve problems like divorce, inheritance, injury, theft. They've preached in public and on the radio to help build peace between communities. My point is that Tayyib always wanted the Somali people to be peaceful, but he also wanted them to be peaceful under Islam, to have an Islamic state. And Tayyib is not alone. In many parts of the world, Muslims are also saying they want to live in Islamic states. In a recent poll, 99% of Muslims in Afghanistan, 89% of Muslims in Palestine, nearly 3/4 of Muslims in Egypt all said the same thing. They want to live under Sharia. And that's the title of my book. It's based on people like Tayyib and around the world who are hoping for Sharia, inshallah. I recognize that not many lawyers and law professors in Western countries take God seriously, but that's why I'm here, to tell a different story about Sharia, and in the process, tell a different story about the rule of law as a kind of empire in itself. My main argument to you today is this. People are using religion and religious faith to do what international human rights law should be doing, to build peace and a path to the rule of law. So people who are fighting dictatorship or oppression, they don't just have to look outward to human rights, they can also look upward to God. To make this argument, that faith in a higher power is guiding people to the rule of law, I'll do three things in my talk. First, I'll talk about the methods I used for the study. Second, I'll discuss the evidence. And third, I'll end with implications for how we understand not only Sharia, but also the rule of law itself as a kind of theology. Let me start with my methods. My main research question on Sharia led me to adopt a triangulated methodology: multi-archival research, qualitative interviews, and ethnographic observations. So I conducted historical research in libraries and archives in the UK, in Cambridge, Durham, London, and Oxford, as well as in Hargeysa and in Nairobi. This white page is Appendix B of my book, naming the 14 archives in 3 countries where I collected historical data. Second, I conducted 142 interviews with officials, judges, lawyers, religious leaders, and activists, civil society groups. The page you see on the top of the screen shows the start of Appendix C of my book, showing the list of persons and places for each of my 142 interviews. They took place primarily in Hargeysa and also in Nairobi and Addis Ababa. I was not able to travel to Mogadishu. I explained this in my book, but I did interview many officials who live and work in Mogadishu, either by telephone or when I met with them in Nairobi and in Hargeysa. I'd be happy to talk about this more. In addition to archival research and interviews, I conducted fieldwork in courts and workshops where civic groups were encouraging state law to grow. These photos are of a district court in Hargeysa and a workshop on constitutional law and justice. I came to this study knowing about the politics of law in another country, Sudan, which is the country I come from. I wrote my first book, which you see here, on legal politics in Sudan. And that book shows how the building blocks of the rule of law, governments, court systems, law schools, prisons, these can also be the bedrock for colonial or authoritarian rule. But beyond trying to build state law, I wanted to learn, what do people do with Sharia? And my research reveals the remarkable ways across 150 years of Somali history that Somalis have embraced Sharia. And let me talk about some of these examples. I wrote a chapter of my book on how Somalis have invoked Sharia to challenge British and Italian colonialism in the 20th century. I found archival records also showing that the British actually imposed their own view of Islam over the Somali people. They brought sheikhs from Sudan and from Mecca to teach Somalis that Islam permitted European colonial rule. And the story from Italian Somalia was similar. I wrote a chapter on the government of Muhammad Siad Barre, who was in power over Somalia and Somaliland from 1969 to 1991. Siad Barre called himself a socialist, like many African leaders at the time did, but he also used Sharia rhetorically to maintain his grip on power, just like the colonial administration did before him. The quote you see is one of many examples of Siad Barre saying publicly that Sharia and socialism were compatible, to get Somalis on board with his dictatorship. And many of the earliest members of the Somali national movement, the SNM, from the start of the 1980s were guided by a commitment to faith that they saw Siad Barre was destroying. But it wasn't just dictators who used Sharia to rule. The photos you see here are of Somalia's parliament approving a national constitution in Mogadishu that proclaimed Sharia as the law of Somalia. And you see people celebrating this decision. Somalis in the 1990s in Mogadishu built Islamic courts to expel warlords. And then Sharia after that became the basis of constitutional order. I remember interviewing a government minister who helped to write Somalia's constitution. And he told me, and I want to quote, "The Somali people trust Sharia more than any other law. You have to use Islam to win their hearts and minds. You have to use Islam to make the law attractive." Elders in Somaliland to the north, the Gurti, they also invoked Sharia to write peace deals and hold reconciliation conferences during the 1990s without any international assistance. I wrote a chapter of my book about Somaliland's commitment to Sharia in the 1990s and again in the 2001 constitution that remains in force today. Somali women activists have regularly discussed the Quran and the Hadith in their struggle against patriarchy. Women I met spoke about women's rights in the context of Islam. When I asked one woman why she fights for women's rights, she said, I do this because I'm Muslim. Every step I take is based on Islam. It's all based on my Islamic religion. The women were citing the Quran and the Hadith to support women's health, girls' education, young women in sports, women in parliament. I want you to know that women's rights activists I met used Sharia principles not only because they believe and because they're pious, but they also turned to Sharia because of strategy. They talked about human rights. They said that whenever they talked about human rights, people thought they were promoting an alien agenda from the West. Civil society organizations I met talked about human rights to their foreign donors, but they told me they can't be seen to support international discourses of human rights or women's rights. One woman said simply, patriarchy will not end unless we promote how we are all Muslim. What you're seeing is a pattern across my historical research. All of these activities, resisting colonialism in the 19th century, fighting Siad Barre in the 20th century, building peace and national identity, and rights for women in Somaliland in the 21st century. These are critical steps to the rule of law, and people are taking those steps with God at their sides. Let me spend the last few minutes reflecting on the theoretical implications of my work, building a socio-legal theory of religion and a theory of the rule of law as a kind of religion in itself. My evidence across nearly 150 years of Somali history shows the ways that people use faith in God to build a path to the rule of law. British colonization imported views of Sharia from Mecca, from Sudan, and even from London. Siad Barre used and tried to stifle the power of Sharia. And people in Somaliland have used Sharia to further a national identity and also women's rights. More generally, my findings help me see remarkable parallels between theology and the rule of law. Now, one of the main reasons for the rule of law is to limit state power, to limit the power of our governments, to make sure no leader can make arbitrary decisions, because state leaders are supposed to limit their power to the law. But people also limit their power under God, not just under law. And so here I am, a lawyer, a professor of international law, talking not about the importance of law in the future of Somaliland and Somalia, but about the importance of God. What this means is that for those of us who care about achieving the rule of law for the Somali people, we cannot just focus our attention on legal reform or human rights or United Nations projects. We may have to think and refocus our lens onto faith. So maybe what we need in the international development community, maybe what we need is not more law or more legal reform. Maybe we need more religion and more faith. Or as legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin wrote in the months before his own death, we need a religious attitude to life. We need to believe that we have made something good in the face of death. So thank you. I look forward to your comments and questions about this hope in Sharia, inshallah.